Hey, thank you for joining me. This is Psych 92, Developmental Psychology, and today we're going to cover Chapter 6, Adolescence. First, we will talk about physical development. So in adolescence, we have a lot of changes going on. So we'll talk about overall growth, the kind of changes that happen. Remember, adolescence is marked by the onset of puberty, what kind of things go on physically in the brain, importance of sleep, nutritional concerns, eating disorders, because it starts to happen at this stage, and also kind of risk factors and the prevalence of teen pregnancy. So adolescence actually comes from an adolescent word, the Latin word for adolescere. It means to grow up. So everywhere in the world, actually, we recognize this important transition, often considered into adulthood. Usually it's about 13 to 19 years old, the onset of puberty, but we've noticed a trend toward younger people getting it as young as 9. And we do believe that this is an environmental consequence, likely because of the processed food that we're eating, that it is impacting how early people are entering puberty. Pet peeve of mine, please make sure you use the correct form of adolescence. So you have adolescence ending CE, that's a period of time, that's the developmental stage. Then you have adolescence ending with TS, and that refers to people, a group of young individuals. So what marks this stage, it's not a specific age, it is the onset of sexual maturity. And then with that onset of sexual maturity, we see that people's social status changes as well. In terms of physical growth, that onset of puberty is what really marks adolescence. And it is essentially sexual maturation. It marks the period at which people can suddenly become parents. And that's kind of frightening, right? So between 8 to 14 years of age, so I thought it was 9, but apparently 8 years old. And these changes occur over about 4 years until it stabilizes. What's interesting is that unlike prenatal development, which is proximal-distal development, in the teenage years, it's distal proximal development, meaning the growth starts in the extremities, in the hands and feet, and then the rest of the body catches up. So this is where that kind of adolescent awkwardness comes in. Like sometimes you'll hear the phrase, oh, you have to grow into your feet. And that's because when people are in puberty, their feet are larger than is probably proportionate. And it takes some time to get used to the larger extremities. Over these 3 to 4 years, people gain an amazing amount of height, 10 to 11 inches, and about 50 to 75 pounds. So it's a really noticeable change. In terms, the change is not only physical, it happens intellectually and emotionally. And again, that sexual maturation impacts every domain of life for people. What's notable, because it's, when people grow 10, 11 inches, when girls start to get menstruation, all of that is actually marked in every known culture in the world. So historically, it's important to know the beginnings, the origins of things like the quinceañera or debut. That was actually a way of families to share with the world that their kids were now available for marriage. It's kind of course, it's changed nowadays, but that was the origin, and that's why you have it in multiple cultures, marking this transition into adulthood. Remember that the term teenager is a 20th century term. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, children basically, once they hit puberty, they were considered adults and they would take on all adult responsibilities. However, because of the Industrial Revolution, when kids became quote unquote adults, they would actually leave their families to go into the cities. So they were no longer staying on the farms to help out. They started to leave. And what society recognized is if these young people were on their own, there was really a need for more education. And so the origins of high school were also in the 20th century. And it was a psychologist named G. Stanley Hall who coined the phrase teenager. And that was as far back as 1904, believe it or not. And originally, the stereotype of adolescence is that it's a time of storm and stress and people, fighting with everybody, really highly emotional. And because of that kind of instability, it became clear to society that we had to have a place to really train and let kids mature during this time. And that was the thought about high school. So between 1910 and 1940, it took 30 years to establish high school and actually started off in New England. So many people don't realize that that is the beginnings of it. In terms of puberty, the definition is that it's a series of biological developments that transition people from childhood into physical maturity. Notice the emphasis on physical maturity. Just because somebody is physically mature does not mean that they are intellectually and emotionally mature at the same time. In terms of physical changes, you see a lot of skeletal growth, as you can see on these diagrams. On the left is male development, on the right is female development, and you can see a notable change between the ages of 9 and 19. Girls grow more slowly than boys do, and so there isn't as marked change in terms of height, but there is a change in body composition. So bones grow, bone mass also increases. Really good idea to actually do some resistance training, not too much, but to start doing that to help support the strength. And this is the time actually when people build the bone density that's going to be really important as you get older. Um, as I mentioned, there's a lot of changes in terms of body shape, but also if you look at this graph over here, you'll see that males and females were really consistent in terms of their strength until puberty, when there just becomes a big change between females and males and a drop off. What affects growth is sleep and nutrition. So these are environmental factors. In order for the growth hormone to kick in, you're actually going to need about 8.5 to 9.5 hours of sleep. So this is a very important time for kids not to lose sleep. And it's hard because the circadian rhythm shifts and our society is based on waking up early and getting things done. And when you're an adolescent, you tend to be more alert at nighttime. So adolescent circadian rhythm is not consistent with society. And so this is why actually there was a law that you couldn't have schools start before, I think it's 8 o'clock, whereas before it used to start about 7:30. And this is in recognition that kids need more sleep. Another important factor is physical exercise. So we want to make sure that people entering puberty get good food, healthy food, not junk food, lots of water, lots of sleep, and actually physical exercise. It's important to also notice that among all the mammals, humans are the only ones to experience a growth spurt like this in puberty. Any questions so far? Okay. Another big change are sex characteristics. So it's important to know the difference. There are two main types. There are primary sex characteristics, which have to do with our reproductive organs. So that would be the uterus, ovaries for males, the penis and testes. So those are the primary sex characteristics. The secondary sex characteristics are the ones we actually see. They're outwardly visible. So these are things like hair growth, the axillary glands, maybe growth of breasts, things like that. Those don't have to do with reproduction, but they are secondary signs that puberty has occurred. So with primary sex characteristics for females, they start to ovulate, meaning that the ovaries start to release eggs. And that first time that the eggs are released is called menarche. For males, it's the testes start to release sperm. They start to produce sperm. And the first time that is released is called semenarche. So that's the first ejaculation. In terms of secondary sex characteristics, we're all familiar with this. Girls start to develop breast buds, have pubic hair, their hips start to get wider in preparation for childbirth. And the axillary hair is hair under the arms. For boys, their larynx actually gets enlarged, which is why you have the noticeable voice changes in males. Testes also start to enlarge. They start to get facial hair, again, pubic hair and axillary hair as well. Other changes because of the hormonal differences, oftentimes people start to get acne. Both males and females' voice have experienced changes. They tend to get deeper. And as I mentioned earlier, the circadian rhythm, meaning their sleep-wake cycle, shifts also. Another thing that occurs because become people in puberty, they become very self-conscious about it. And so there's something called gender role intensification, where girls might play down the changes, or they become hyper feminine, really emphasize makeup and, wear clothing that emphasizes their figure, things like that. And boys may tend to become hyper masculine, where they want to really show that they're men at this stage. So given that we have this wide range between 8 and 13, it's important to note that the timing really matters, right? So in westernized countries, what we're seeing is that it's happening earlier. And the factors, as I mentioned previously, could be the processed food that we're eating, if people have a high calorie diet. So one of the triggering points of puberty is actually fat content. And it really makes sense because evolutionarily speaking, for females especially, there needs to be a certain optimal fat content in order to carry a child all the way to full term, a healthy child. So that's one of the triggers of puberty. If people are really stressed out, it could possibly delay puberty. Also, if people have a more lean or athletic build, puberty will likely be delayed. And that's why you'd see maybe a lot of Olympic gymnasts. They tend to have puberty later than most people because their fat content is really low. So those are different factors that could impact it. Um, we have a lot of variability in terms of early maturation. So there's a technical definition. You are considered an early mature of puberty if fewer than 3% of your peers have also hit puberty at that age. You're considered a late mature in puberty if 97% of your peers have already hit puberty. So it is in relation to other people of your age. So there are genetic factors and environmental factors involved with the timing of puberty. So genetic factors accounts for 50% of the timing. So take a look at your parents and your ancestors and your siblings. That will give you a good sense of when puberty might hit you. And there's a really strong association between moms and daughters, not only the timing of puberty, but the actual experience of it. So if moms tend to have very painful menstruation and PMS, lots of PMS symptoms, sorry to tell you, it's very likely the daughters will have it as well. So that's the genetic component. Environmentally, we're seeing globally that the age of onset is dropping. Again, it could be, a lot of it could be actually the nutrition component, that when people have high fat content foods, lots of fast food, that increases the percentage of fat in their bodies, and that will make the onset of puberty tend to be earlier. In terms of nutrition, important terms to know, believe it or not, this is the first time in society that we can have overnourishment, right? Meaning more people are overweight and obese, but be malnutritioned. So overnourishment refers to having a calorie surplus. Malnourishment, undernourishment, right? That could actually have to do with your actual nutritions that you, the vitamins, all those kind of things that you have. So it is very possible for somebody to be obese and malnourished in this day and age. As I mentioned, this is the time that we become very concerned about people getting eating disorders. Remember that in middle and late childhood, people start to compare themselves with others. Well, that's even magnified more in adolescence. And so eating disorders becomes a very high risk. 3 main types you need to know: anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder. So with anorexia nervosa, people restrict what they're eating. They basically starve themselves. They're really frightened of gaining weight. And there's something called body dysmorphia where they don't even see what the rest of us see. They always see themselves as too fat. And so there's a huge emotional toll when you're always feeling like this. So with anorexia nervosa, it really entails food restriction. You're basically not eating. In bulimia nervosa, you starve yourself and then you binge eat. So that's one major difference. So with the binge eating, after they binge eat, which means they eat a lot of food, so they starve, 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 and then they suddenly get hungry and then they eat a lot of food and then they feel bad about it. And so they engage in compensatory behaviors like vomiting. Maybe they'll induce vomiting. They might take laxatives. They might, exercise a crazy amount, just trying to get rid of any calories that they gained when they did the binge eating. So anorexia is just restriction of food, basically just starving themselves. With bulimia nervosa, starve themselves, binge eat, and then compensatory behavior. And then in binge eating disorder, it's like they're trying really hard not to eat, but then they have recurrent episodes of binge eating. And after they eat, they just feel horrible. So that's the difference. Anorexia nervosa, they don't binge eat, right? They just restrict calorie intake. Bulimia nervosa, they starve, restrict calorie intake, reach a point where they can't do it anymore, and then binge eat, and then engage in compensatory behaviors. With binge eating disorder, they have the binge eating, they're trying to lose weight, but then they keep, getting into the binge eating parts. And then it's more of a psychological distress that they feel. They don't engage in binge eating disorders. Any questions about these three? Okay, so with eating disorders, we see it often begins in the teen years. It does affect both males and females, although the prevalence is much higher in females, twice as common. And we see it across cultures. Anorexia nervosa, we see in more European backgrounds. It has the highest fatality rate of any mental disorder, and it's because they're starving themselves. So it's a really horrible, very difficult mental disorder to have. And it's usually associated with body dysmorphia. As you can see in this picture, she's very thin. She's skeletal in the picture. And then what she sees is that she's heavier. So that is the idea of body dysmorphia. Some short-term and long-term consequences if people have anorexia because they are restricting their food intake. Oftentimes they'll end up with osteoporosis. They won't have, their bones will be very, very weak. And it could get to the point where they experience organ failure. So that's why it has a really high fatality rate. Bulimia, because there is that starving, binge eating, can have a lot of digestive problems. If somebody's engaging in self-induced vomiting, the dentist will know because vomit is very acidic, and so it shows up in the teeth. And it could also cause heart trouble because you're putting your body through a lot of extremes when you have bulimia. And then in binge eating, what ends up happening here is, the person will just keep gaining weight that they don't want to gain. And being overweight and obese is associated with a whole host of physical problems like high blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes. So there are a lot of negative consequences to it. And as I mentioned before, anorexia nervosa has the highest death rate of any psychiatric condition. In terms of treatment, group therapy is very helpful, and I would recommend therapy support for families of people with eating disorders as well, so that they learn how to best support, their family member who has the disorder. So medical care is often really important, nutritional counseling, also the mental health counseling, because this starts with a psychological issue, really. So the Maudsley approach is one in which the whole family is involved, the parents and the person who's having the eating disorder. And cognitive behavioral therapy is found to be very, very effective in terms of mitigating eating disorders because cognitive behavioral therapy focuses on identifying problematic thought patterns and interrupting those thought patterns that cause the behavior that ends up with an eating disorder. Any questions about this one? All right. Physical activity, really important in adolescence, right? If somebody has low levels of physical activity, that can end up, with a calorie surplus and then gaining more weight than they really should. High levels of activity, right? What happens there is it reduces the calories, lowers your body fat percentage, and so it can delay the onset of puberty. With mental health, it's interesting. We know it affects the onset of puberty, but it differs. So for some people, it can trigger early onset. For other people, it can trigger late onset. So it's not consistent. We know that it is correlated with the onset of puberty, but there seem to be differences in terms of how it affects people. In terms of culture, as I mentioned before, many religions recognize the onset of puberty, entrance into adolescence. So we have ways of doing it ceremonially. We also have institutional ways. We kind of celebrate that. Kids get into high school at that point. And of course, there is the impact of media. You can't deny that sometimes, people have an inaccurate assumption of what is socially acceptable in terms of standards of beauty, things like that. And it could lead to body dysmorphia. So continuing on with environmental factors, I think the society really undervalues sleep, and I'm guilty of it myself. So in puberty, you have delayed circadian phase, meaning that the sleep-wake cycle is later than it is for other people of other developmental stages. Optimally, we want people to get about 8 to 9 hours of sleep, and I know that's really hard. What are some factors that affect people in terms of their sleep? Well, biological, that's your circadian rhythm. Academic demand, so sometimes people lose sleep because they're doing homework, right? So that's why you got to plan it out. So you try not to do all-nighters. Um, Having your phone and electronics in your bedroom, really bad idea. You want to leave all of that outside or put away so that you're not tempted to go look at it. And as people enter adolescence, there tends to be decreased parental control. And so you leave people to their own devices, they just tend to sleep later. Yes, I know it's easier said than done. I agree completely. But let's at least make the effort to try to sleep earlier, right? And it's also okay, like, to break it up. So let's say you only get 6 hours of sleep. Take power naps. They actually do help during the day, 20, 30 minutes. It will help you. Consequences of sleep deprivation, yeah, attention, hard to stay focused when you're sleepy, so that will lower your academic achievement. Sometimes people start to take pills to help them get through the day, so the substance abuse component. Depression, irritability can also occur because of sleep deprivation. And we will talk about the importance of sleep in every developmental stage. It's especially important in adolescence because it does impact someone's growth. So in terms of timing, for girls who have it early, a lot of negative consequences, unfortunately. So girls who have early onset puberty tend to have higher levels of depression, also more susceptible to eating disorders because, as I mentioned, when you hit puberty, there's kind of a fat percentage there. And so once you enter puberty, actually, your body is getting ready to have a baby. And so you'll tend to keep fat in areas that you weren't used to it. And it was very disturbing to some girls, and they could end up with eating disorders because of it. Also, because of this depression, eating disorders feeds into drug and alcohol and tobacco use. Tobacco use, because girls who have early onset puberty are perceived to be older. And so older males will tend to give them attention and also entice them into more adult-like behaviors. So again, that includes sexual behavior. So girls who have early onset puberty are at higher risk also of running away, of dropping out of school. So there are a lot of, unfortunately, negative consequences in terms of risk factors for girls who have early onset puberty. And the decrease is in academic performance. So on the other hand, as I mentioned, the reason why is because when girls have early onset puberty, they're perceived to be older. They get the parents also see them as, oh, you're like a little adult, you can be more responsible. And so there's less adult supervision. So there's more adult attention from people outside of the family and less adult supervision within the family. And those kind of combine to have a lot of negative outcomes for girls. So in terms of boys, it's interesting. What we find is that if they are very early or very late, it becomes an increased risk for depression. However, for boys who have early onset puberty, there are a lot more positive consequences, right? So there is that component of drug, alcohol use. Again, same as for girls, perceived as being older. So their, peers and people outside will tend to treat them as adults, right? And they get enticed into these things. Um, Emotional stability is also decreases similar to girls. However, the part that's positive for boys is because the onset of puberty increase is a lot of increase in physical stature. It's an advantage in sports, right? So then they do better in sports than their peers who are late onset. And that kind of positivity has a lot of positive consequences for boys. So in terms of both males and females, what increases with early onset puberty, risk-taking behaviors, risk of being overweight or obese, risk of disease that ties in with the becoming overweight or obese, and also mortality because of those risk-taking behaviors and maybe any kind of problematic eating patterns that they might have. For girls, actually, not for boys, the adult stature is decreased. So girls who have early onset puberty tend to be shorter than their peers who start later. Because for girls, when they start puberty, their growth spurt actually it just stops. It starts to decrease incredibly. What do we find is that regardless of early onset or late onset, sports is actually a protective factor, right? You have a built-in community of people who have common interests, and that's also helpful. So it is associated with an increase in well-being and associated with decrease of depression and drug use, because in many sports, they actually do testing. Also associated more positively with academic performance and relationship with parents. So the relationship with parents part comes because at this age, you have to rely on your parents for transportation. And so the parents have a lot more time with kids who are involved in sports, and that ends up having more positive relationships. So another aspect, of course, if we're talking about sexual maturation, this is the time when sexual activity starts. So people start to notice others in a sexual way about age 10 to 11. And shockingly, in a study, around 50% of kids, teenagers are saying that they have engaged in sexual activity before they graduated high school. So that's really concerning. I'm a parent, so I'm like, oh my goodness. And the truth is, it's really hard to determine because this is self-report. So if we get self-report that says 50% have had sexual intercourse, that is probably way off because a lot of people will not admit to that, right? So what we've noticed, the patterns are that boys tend to say they have when they haven't, and girls tend to say they haven't when they have. So it might, even out, but the truth is that we're not totally sure what the rate of sexual activity is in high school because we have to rely on self-report. In terms of teen pregnancy, the wonderful news is that the rate has been dropping consistently. So in 1991, it was the peak of teen pregnancy, which was 61.8 people per 1,000. Now we're at 15.1. So we are still, as a country, higher than a lot of other developed countries. And you'll see that there are group differences. So this figure here shows birth rates and it's disaggregated by ethnic racial group. So you'll see Hispanic ethnicity has the higher rates than we have Black African American. We have the total, the average, and then we have white, which is below. So there are group differences in terms of the prevalence of teen pregnancy. Not only are there group differences in terms of racial and ethnic groups, There are regional differences. So this here, you'll see this map. If it's light blue, if it's white, you're not seeing it at all. Light cream is lower rates, and then the red are the highest rates of teen pregnancy. So it's really interesting that even though you consider, oh, US has higher rates than other countries, when you break it down, you'll see that it's really happening more often in some southern states than in the western or far eastern states. So we're concerned about teen pregnancy because there are a lot of negative consequences to it. Those who become teen parents have a higher risk of dropping out. Of course, you have these, you have these little people counting on you, right? Overall outcomes in life, because they drop out, lower socioeconomic status, life over. And what was fascinating and really sad is that just this year there was a study on over 2 million women. And what they found is that those who were teen moms, as in they carried the babies to term, had a higher risk of dying by the age of 31. And that is really alarming to have that thought. But fortunately, the rates of teen pregnancy are dropping. And we'll talk about this more in the socio-emotional development component. In terms of brain changes, a lot is going on in the brain. What's happening now is the different lobes are becoming more interconnected. And now you're seeing a lot more specialization. So the corpus callosum, which are the muscle fibers that connect the brain, the left and right hemisphere, that thickens. And that's what that strengthens the connections among the brain components. So the hippocampus and the frontal lobe connections also gets thickened and strengthened. Why is that important? Frontal lobe, remember, that's your decision-making component. The hippocampus, which is over in the temporal lobe, that is your memory. So what that's saying is that you are going to remember negative experiences. Maybe you're going to remember advice from other people before you make a decision and do things. So that's good news. What else do we see? We see that myelination continues. So again, we don't want to be in a low-fat diet. We want to eat natural foods, organic foods, plant-based as much as possible. Synapses development also continues. And what we're seeing is that we have much more pruning. So remember that whole idea of use it or lose it definitely is at play in adolescence. And so skills and competencies, memories, facts that aren't being used are likely going to be lost at this stage. I have a good video about adolescent brain changes. Maybe we'll show that in class, we'll see. What we see also that affects people is that the limbic system is that's what regulates your emotion reward. And what we see is that in adolescence, that system is really, really active. And what we notice is that the reward system is especially activated when teenagers have, interactions with their peers and with risk taking. So that's kind of scary, right? Also, what we notice is that teens weigh the risk reward component differently than adults do. Dopamine, which makes people feel really good, is actually released when they have, rewards. So it's like, oh, when the peers, congratulate them, when things happen, they feel better than adults do because we all feel good when our peers recognize us, right? But in relatively speaking, teenagers feel higher levels of that pleasure and reward when they get that from their peers rather than their families. So that's really interesting. Oxytocin is known as the love hormone, also makes us feel good, makes us feel attached to people. And what we see is that it's at this age, you have more oxytocin released when they're interacting with their peers as opposed to their family members. So when you combine this idea of the limbic system being hyperactive, greater sense of reward, not great, impulse control, can lead to poor decision making. So it's really a big component of it. So overall, physical changes in adolescence, we have the growth of the physical stature growth, right? Remember that it's distal proximal development, meaning that your hands and feet grow before the rest of your body. It is marked by sexual maturation. We notice secondary sexual characteristics, but what's the primary sexual characteristic changes are in the reproductive organs. Also, what affects onset would be genetic factors, about 50%. And then we have the environmental factors, which are nutrition, exercise, water, sleep. There are consequences for timing. Generally, early timing has more negative consequences than late. But for boys, early timing has more positive consequences. We have these different brain changes going on. Corpus callosum is more connected to the hippocampus. We have the limbic system being really hyperactive. We have the idea of impulse control is still not great in here. And the idea that dopamine, more dopamine and oxytocin is released when they're interacting with peers, which we'll speak to later on in the socio-emotional development. So any questions about this component? Okay, I'm going to stop this recording.